All right. Well, let's pray and we'll get started. Oh God, what we do this morning is we devote this time, and in doing so, we want to devote who we are and what we're about. And so everything that makes us who we are, if we were to talk about it in terms of mind, body, and spirit, then Lord, you understand what we mean by that. And so we want to devote all of that, our full selves, to this moment, this time. We want to learn. We want to reflect. We want to have a degree of openness to your spirit in such a way that what comes out in conversation, what comes out in processing and conclusions and in thinking, that your hand is very much a part of that. For those that are joining us through the internet, we also pray this for them, for all of us, as we devote this time of learning and this time of study and reflection. The end goal for us, oh God, is that this becomes a means to an end. And it's not just knowledge, or it's not just community or fellowship that we're after, that those are components of it. But what we're after is something more valuable, something that leads to degrees of change inside of us. And so the good thing about you, O God, is that you know our hearts, you know our minds, you know the circumstances that we are in at this very moment. And so however you need to move and to recreate and to mold us, knowing that it might be different for each and every one of us, we're open to that today. And we ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay. So we're in the book of Exodus. Just out of curiosity, did anybody see that movie God and Kings? One, two. It's a movie that came out, I don't know, maybe in the fall, that has to do with the Exodus, Moses and Pharaoh and it's still there. It's still there. Brooke and I were going to try to go over the weekend, but it's only like at late. Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, you might have saw that one. You know, Brooke has informed me that if Moses looked like Christian Bale, the modern actor, and probably the same as Charleston Heston, she would be no problem. She would have a problem getting in line and following. So, I don't know what that means about theology, but. Right. Yeah, but if you haven't seen it and you want to see it, I think it'd be good to, since we're beginning this study, to kind of at least make some comparisons on the first part of it. It's probably going to be gone, if I had to guess, in about a couple of weeks, and then you can just download it on your TV, or something. But it got a lot of debate among scholars about how true or untrue it was with the scriptures, and so it's interesting to see. It's somebody. Just keep in mind, it's not a, they didn't set out to make the movie to prove the existence of the book of Exodus, or this is Hollywood's taking something and turning it into, like the Passion of the Christ. Jesus didn't look like that guy, okay? And Satan or whoever, it's just keep in mind with a grain of salt that it's just a God and Kings. And but what's interesting is that you've got an interplay between Moses and Pharaoh, and really God and Pharaoh, which is what we'll see in the very beginning of, like say, about for the first 11 chapters or so. What the writer of Exodus portrays for us is who's going to be the dominant player. That's really what's at stake. Who ultimately is in control. But before we get into the text, let's kind of just look over some of the basic information of Exodus that might be helpful in our understanding. And some of this is probably going to bring back some painful memories of either high school or college history. But it's not a bad thing for us to kind of revisit our history books and our history lessons. Now, what's that? The history parts? Well, then you're going to love a new sermon series that we're starting Sunday, which is called The Lesson from the Kings. And we're going to spend some time in 1st and 2nd Kings and then some time in Chronicles, picking up some of the good kings and some of the bad kings of both the northern and the southern kingdoms and what we can learn from their life. We're going to be in there for the next 6 weeks or so. Sally, I'm in agreement with you. I love the historical parts of the Old Testament. I think those are just fascinating. And, actually, if you want to see some real life, if you want to see something that's easy comparisons to our life, you read the beginnings of the Old Testament. Genesis is the most dysfunctional human story there is. You can't get out of Genesis 2.5 before you start to say, oh my, this is like either my life or so-and-so's life or whatever, And one of the beauties of the Old Testament that we really don't pay attention to, and it even shows up, it's not so much in the New Testament because you get a great deal of theological reflection that shows up in the New Testament. Not so much on day 1 they went here, day 2 they went there and whatnot, like you do in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it doesn't run from human depravity. It's a rated R book, almost rated X. If you read the book of Genesis and you pay attention to what you're reading, boy, it's you got to read like this. It's kind of it's not what you read your kids for bedtime stories. Now we have this wonderful ability to romance some of the stories, in our Sunday school lessons, like with King David and things of that nature. But there's some wonderful parts about King David, but boy, there's some not so good parts. And when you read Genesis, you get into just real. You get waist deep into the good, the best things about humanity and the worst things about humanity. And so what is wonderful about that, and you see it also in Exodus, what I think is wonderful about that is when you read that, you realize that God adored these people and interacted with them. And if He will do that with them, then you can make the jump or make the conclusion that I don't have to fear that. If God loves these people who connive and who are jealous and who are prideful and full of anger and full of vengeance, and they act those out as if you're watching some, Game of Thrones or whatever that show is, that's on now. I guess that's on now. Guess what? That's the book of Genesis. It is filled with all types of stuff, and saying because that also is some of the foundation for us to as we move into Exodus. You can't just pick up with Exodus without at least knowing some aspect of what was going on, at least from Abraham covenant forward, which shows up around Genesis 12. And so, when you get Genesis 12 forward, then you start to see some covenant, a covenant acting God that is interesting for us. And Exodus brings a lot of that together and sort of clarifies and then that becomes a springboard for the rest of the Old Testament and even into some of the New Testament. For instance, when you read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it references back so much to Exodus and how seen through, the acts that took place in the Exodus, how that gets reinterpreted to some degree or seen through the lens of Christ. And so all these things that start to get nailed down in the book of Exodus, that the writer of Hebrews sees all of that and how God acts there and what God makes good on, how on a larger level He makes good on with Christ. So really fantastic stuff. All right, but we need to know something about some of these old ages and because we don't know much, at least from the Bible's perspective. Once you start getting in between these periods, and now think back to history lessons, you've got early Bronze 1, early Bronze 2, early Bronze 3. So this 1,000 years can be broken down into the three components. Basically Genesis, starts in this area. The patriarchs start in this area. We don't get a lot, before this time period, at least that we can date with some outside sources. I mean, we don't have anything that shows up in archaeology. We don't find, there's not, that can really date that. And so when you look at biblical sources, and then you look at non-canonical or non-biblical sources. Am I on? All right, I just want to make sure. Okay, good. We're somewhere in this area right here. And what's that?
I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
I've read for a long time about Sumer.
Right.
And I mean, that's it right there. It's even earlier than that. The writing was, they
right.
had the plow there.
That's right.
There are all kinds of things happen.
I mean, because before this, you get some Stone Age activity. You get the Copper Stone Age, and then you move into early Bronze. And what you find in early Bronze, is you have the beginning of cities, where cities are being built all over this area. If you were to kind of go out into Iraq and all that, Fertile Crescent stuff, around the Nile area in Egypt. In the early Bronze, you don't have the major dynasties yet, but you do have some people starting to consolidate power in this time period. In the Palestine area, you've got some cities that are starting to be built somewhere before the 3000 BC period, but they begin to grow rapidly. I mean, just what you have in this area is people starting to come together more. And when you get into maybe around the 2900 BC to 2650 BC, in Egypt, you start to have the beginning, or you start to see some of the first and second dynasties. Near the end of the Bronze Age, you've got the Old Kingdom, some of the pyramids, things of that nature. You remember Abraham leaves Ur. You remember that in Genesis 11? I think it's right at the very end of 11. Either 11 or 12. Ur in the late early Bronze Age, you have Ur really becoming a dominant place. And so, what we would do is we would say, okay, Abraham is probably working somewhere in this time period. And then you have, of course, how Genesis plays out some of the people that come after him. So it's just important to know what's kind of going on, just in some degree. When you get into the Middle Bronze Age in this time period, you've got the end of the Old Kingdom in Egypt is starting to lose its footing. The Old Kingdom's losing its footing. You're getting close to what they call the Middle Kingdom. Different dynasties are coming. And the dynasties, think of it in terms of this way. Ruling classes in Egypt is not much different than ruling classes in Europe. They're family dominated. So you might have the Stuarts coming to power, or the Tudors coming to power, or whatnot. In Egypt, you have different, same thing with the pharaohs. You have pharaohs, and then family lines are in power for a while, and then what happens is somebody comes and kills the big man, and all of a sudden they set up their reign, and that lasts for a while, and if they can solidify, it's good. And when a ruling power, when a new ruling class comes in, what do they do to the former class? Kill them all. It's not just the pharaoh. It's all the pharaoh's descendants. Anybody that's a relative, cousin, twice removed, does not matter. The idea is you wipe out that entire, all the Greens get wiped out to make way for the Norses, and so anybody that's related to the Greens, they're gone.
Didn't God say do that to King Solomon?
You have David. Now, David does not do that, because one of Saul's sons, Mephibosheth or whatever, he has a crippled leg and whatnot. David shows him grace, but you do have that shows up in biblical writings and non-biblical writings. I mean, it's, whether or not God says it or whether or not it's blessed by God, it was a practice that was definitely practiced in that day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but for some reason I thought that one of the reasons Saul lost being king was because he didn't do that. He didn't obey.
No, Saul lost his kingship because he was impatient and he didn't wait for Samuel to make the altar. Well, go back. All right, Saul comes into play as the king, and there is level of fear, just as there are in any. I mean, you go back and look at some of the non-canonical, what we mean by that is non-biblical writings that talk about leaders. Well, and you see it with Pharaoh. The number one reason that Pharaoh and the Hebrews don't get along is fear from Pharaoh. He looks out one day and they're more numerous than we are. We got a population problem. That's what it says in chapter 1, and you see how that gets played out in chapter 2. So he institutes two things to kind of get control of the population. You know what they are? Now, some of y'all are supposed to have read this, so exactly right. What do? We got genocide and labor camps. And so I mean that's what happened. What happens throughout history? Well, you can control the population and you can force labor, whatever. So it's no different with Pharaoh. Now, when Saul comes in to be king, it goes good for a while, and eventually Saul is winning in battles, and he's starting to on one front he's solidifying the border of his kingdom, and on the other one he's expanding. And so he's protecting one and he's expanding another, and he's got an opportunity where some of his enemies are encamped poorly in a valley, and he's on the mountainside, and so he can fight downhill, which is a military advantage in that day. And so he's ready to go. He calls what they normally do. They call the prophet. The prophet then makes a sacrifice, seeks God's wisdom should they attack, whatever. Saul is not willing to wait. And so he just says, I'll make the sacrifice myself. I don't know the chapter and verse. I can find it at the break. And then Samuel rolls up about the time Saul is finished and says, whoa, wait a minute. And the issue that what Saul had was, I don't need God for me. That's the real issue behind it. And so what Samuel says is, hey, God's got a message for you. It has nothing to do with the battle. Your days are numbered. And not only they're numbered, you're going to die. Your sons are going to die. They're going to die this way, and dogs are going to come in and eat their remains, and that's what happens. And and then you do have some of that shows up in the Old Testament with leaders. When then the kingdom of Israel is united. Both Israel is the northern kingdom, or it's called the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom is called Judah. It is united under David and Solomon. After Solomon's death, it splits back into the two, and they just do not play well at all. And the northern kingdom basically survives for about another, I don't know, maybe 130, 40 years, and then they're wiped out by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom makes it a little bit longer for a couple hundred years, and then they're wiped out by the Babylonians. But in those times, what you'll discover is that when, Shane is the king of the northern kingdom, and then Connor takes over, and then, Shane the third or Connor, whatever, his son takes over, and then, somebody else comes in and wipes them out, and then they establish their, sometimes it's under, it's God's doing because the kings are bad. And basically God talks to the prophet and says, hey, you got to go find me another one. And so they go and find one, and that person comes in. And one of the kings we're going to look at on Sundays, not this Sunday, but in the Sundays coming, is that they were picked to usurp another leader, with the caveat that says, if you will, when you get into leadership, if you will be faithful, your descendants are not going to have a problem. Well, what happens is he gets in there, he does what God says, he secures the throne. Well, about 2 years into it, he decides, just like Saul, I don't need any help. I want to do it my way. Well, guess what? It doesn't work. And so you do have inside of Scripture and outside of Scripture when a ruling party or class, when they are usurped or however you want to define that, everybody goes. Seldom are someone kept in hiding like in France, so they can go back through Scotland and come back down and take over England. That doesn't happen. Not in this area, and especially not in Egypt. But so you have what we know about Genesis is in this period is when we see this. We have probably the beginning of, we think for the most part, we're going to get into this in just a second, that Jacob goes to Egypt sometime in Middle Bronze. And so the issue for us will be is when does the Exodus take place? Now, what makes this incredibly difficult for us is that Pharaoh is not mentioned. Now, it's not mentioned on purpose because when you read chapter 1 and chapter 2, I want you to pay attention to who is named and who is not. That's real important because names in the Bible give status. They give, some of them either talk about who they are as a character or it paints the picture of what they hope they'll grow into. But the fact that someone is named is very important. Pharaoh is never named in Exodus. Now, think about this. He is in that area at this time the most powerful person. So if you're reading the book of Exodus and you've got the biggest person on the block, and they would have known this name, okay? I mean, it would have been everywhere, put, on every building and, whatnot. And yet the Exodus writer does not name him, which is interesting. That's exactly right. It actually names women before it will actually name men. Before it names Pharaoh. And there's actually 5 people who is, with the 5th person we'll call Pharaoh's daughter.
You're saying he's not in Exodus 1?
He's not named in Exodus, the whole book. They call him Pharaoh or they call him the Egyptian king, but his name is not given. Right. I mean, his name as in, right. Is he Ramses? Is he, whoever? He's not named, but yet the midwives, their name that they're called, they are mentioned. Moses' mother, she is mentioned. Moses' sister, she is mentioned. Not just, oh yeah, Moses' mom, Moses' sister. No, their actual name is given. That's very significant. So when you're reading the text and you look at it, and the most powerful person in that area, that person's name is not given. And yet all these other people who would be of very low status, they are. So what do you draw from that? What are some of the conclusions that you can think about? All right, one at a time. We're going too fast right now. Right, exactly right. What you have is, it is, not irony, but you've got just a theological backhand, to Pharaoh. And so, because what's at stake in the beginning of the book of Exodus, at least for the first part of it, is who ultimately is the big man. Pharaoh means big man in the big house. That's what it means, okay? And so, who is the big man in the big house? Is it going to be Pharaoh, who's not named, and whose name do you get on a personal level in Exodus that you did not get in Genesis? Burning bush, Yahweh, first time. All right, so you can see some of this being played out that you have that the writer gives us. That's just really. If you did not approach the book of Exodus with any aspect of faith or any aspect of a faith worldview, a faith lens, and you look at Exodus and you're reading it just as hey, I've just picked this thing up, right off the bat, you get Pharaoh as just a nobody. And yet anybody who's connected to Yahweh, they're somebodies. That's interesting. Because in society in that day, it would have been the opposites. Pharaoh's name would have been uttered as Lord. Okay? Midwives would have been, who cares? All right? And an enslaved mother. And see, not only that, the midwives, they're breaking the law. I mean, so is Moses' mother. Well, she's fulfilling the law to, with the letter of the law. She's just not doing it with the intent of what the law was about. Well, because what's the law? What are you supposed to do with babies? How? Throw them in the Nile. What does she do with Moses? She throws him in the Nile. He got a boat. So she is being obedient to the letter of the law, which is interesting. My son, he's going for his learner's permit today. And so we've been working on him driving and trying to get him to understand. And it's not bad. He's a good student on this, because he's cautious, which is what I like right now. And Dad, the sign says this. Like this morning, we were riding down the road, and the speed limit was 40. Well, I was going 42. And he was like, "Well, hang on now, Dad. How do you keep it right at 40?" And I said, "Son, it's not right at 40." I said, we got some play. It's 5-7 miles per hour. Better to err on the lower end than the higher end. But it's kind of what obeying the letter and the intent when it comes to driving, we all struggle with. So, but anyways, so do what? Well, we'll see. And so anyway, we got the. What's interesting is that we know that Exodus. Where's my marker? We know that the children of the children of Israel, the Hebrews, move south because of under Jacob. Jacob is the patriarch. There's famine in Joseph. You remember that whole story. Somewhere in this time period right here, and somewhere in this time period is when we have the Exodus. And there's two major dates, but because Pharaoh's not named, it's hard to determine for sure. And so the most popular one has to do with what we call the Hyksos reign. They are if you read in history, if you Google up shepherd kings, that's what you're going to get. And we know that in between these dynasties in here, that you have the end of some major dynasties that went on for a number of families. And then, but before you have another major dynasty of Egyptian rulers, they are what we call these shepherd kings who rule. And they end up, they are in history, they destroy or they get rid of the old Egyptian Pharaoh. They set themselves up as leaders. They rule Egypt for a while, and then old school Egypt comes back into power, and they push the shepherd kings out. The shepherd kings, when you look at non-canonical history, or people who write and who've got some record of what the shepherd kings acted like, looked like, things of that nature, it fits in line with people who would have been where Jacob was. There's actually some names where you've got some of the leaders, some of the shepherd king pharaohs or shepherd king rulers. One of them was Jacob LL. Right? L being, and that's part of it being describe where you're at, part of it being God that you're associated with. One of the earlier names for God in the Old Testament is Elohim. You ever heard that? That's where, the L part is important. Another one is Jacob Bethel, and so, there's just enough evidence for us to for the primary view would be that in this reign of shepherd kings is probably where Jacob came to power. Remember, Joseph came to power, who was friendly towards the Hebrews. Does that make sense? All right. So I know it's a lot of history, but it's helpful to understand some of this stuff.
Where did you see that there were dangers in the
I think it might be about the end of. Let me pull up Exodus. Right at the very end of chapter 1, verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. So, yeah. So, well, what happened is there is sort of like a blitzkrieg type deal. They come in and they kill all the boys at a certain age. And then boys who are born after that, the command is, we already sent the troops in, we killed them all. So, still going to have boys being born, throw them in the Nile going forward. So that's the rule that's set up. So anyway, what we have basically is we pretty much, the majority thought among scholars and historians and theologians is that around 1300 BC is when we think the Exodus took place. Where we get that is we start in the Hyksos reign, and Exodus 12:40 says that the people were in Egypt for about 430 years, and so you can kind of get to 1300. But if you work, that's going from starting of their reign to when they leave. If you work backwards, then you get this alternative date from when in Judges 11:26 it tells us that the conquest is when they take over Canaan. That the conquest pretty much is completed in Jephthah's lifetime. Well, we know that Jephthah lived around 1100 BC. We know that it took about 300 years. So if you work backwards, you get 1400 BC. Now that's a difference of 100 years, and so on one level you think, gosh, that's heavy. That's a pretty big range, 100 years. If we were to date something, if I was to tell you something was dated in 1950 compared to 1850, and I had it wrong by 100 years, you would probably think, gosh, he's terrible. But they didn't keep histories that way. One of them, time for Hebrew time in the Old Testament is seldom chronological. All right? So when you read, when you read the Psalms and they say, God, a day for you is like 10,000 years for us, is that literal? I mean, is it literally 10,000 years? Okay, maybe. It could be. But, considering the genre of the writing, which is more poetic, when Shakespeare writes when time, do we interpret Shakespeare to be literal time? Well, probably not. And so we can we just add the same type of principles to this, and so the key for us is not whether or not it's 1300 BC or 1400 BC. The real issue is, did the Exodus take place? That's really what's at stake. And, of course, in the Old Testament, the answer is yes. But you can go on these digs, you can pay your money and go over this area, and you might be the one that finds the missing link to what the actual date is, and in about 30 years after it gets certified and verified and whatnot, we can read your writings on it. And if some of you want to still wrestling with that PhD that you wanted to do, guess what? You can do it. We can go around the date of the date of Exodus. So, but 1300, 1400 BC, somewhere in the neighborhood is when some of the latest information on trying to find the most accurate date is not looking at the reign or not looking at Jephthah. There are some cities that are mentioned in, I think, either Exodus 1 or Exodus 2. They're doing some archaeological work in those cities to see if that can help us with the naming of the Pharaoh. And if we can get a more concrete name for the Pharaoh, and it's either Ramses or it's somebody else, but if we can find some more evidence, most people believe it's Ramses II, I think, then like when you watch the Charleston Heston 10 Commandments, it's Ramses II. Now, I haven't seen God and King, so I'm not sure which one they use. But anyway. So, but under Joseph, children of Israel, they expand. They enjoy a good life under him. What we think is under these shepherd kings. He's some level of Pharaoh's deputy or vice regent or area manager or whatever. But the area where the Hebrews are, they do well. What we can conclude from the scriptures is that there's a change in government, a change in leadership. The way the text says it, there was a time when Pharaoh did not know Joseph, Okay, that's I think what the language says in Exodus 1. And so Joseph dies, change of rulers, and whatever level of status of or benefactors or whatever, that goes away. And so there's a change that takes place in Exodus 1 from, the idea of it being okay at the end of Genesis and in what we'd probably read the first little parts of Exodus, but not long into Exodus 1, we realize that it's the tide has turned, the winds have changed, and a new leader takes over, and this new leader is for either good or bad reasons paranoid about the Hebrew population. But now I'm going to give a word of defense for the Pharaoh. If you push out these shepherd kings, let's just say it's under the leadership of the shepherd kings. They are not homegrown Egyptians. All right, they come in from the north, and this is proven by non-canonical writings. They come in from the north. They reign for a couple of hundred years inside of Egypt. Old school Egypt family kicks out the shepherd kings. All right, so but you know that the Hebrews did well under the shepherd kings. So if you now have gotten the reins of power, and you've pushed out at least the leadership of these northerners, we pushed them out. Now, we got back the reins the way we should be, and but there are a host of Hebrews that are still there that were friendly towards the shepherd kings. Militarily speaking, what do? That's exactly right. So in a word of defense for the Pharaoh is, his paranoia might be fairly common among the most of us. I mean, for a couple of centuries now, non-Egyptian rulers have been ruling Egypt. Old school Egypt finally gets the reins back from the outsiders. Okay? And so you're now in power, and the people and they're numerous, okay? It's not like it's just one block. This is a ton of folks. Militarily speaking, you have got to control that threat, because if the outsiders flank you and come back in, well, who's going to fight for them? Old school Egypt? I mean, where would the Hebrews naturally fight for? That's exactly right. Or if you're this other power who's starting to get some momentum, and there were some others who are at this time. See, you've got all these dynasties of Egypt, but at the same time, we don't have a map big enough. If we go over here to you've got to some degree the Philistines. All right, they have iron. What separates Bronze Age from Iron Age is, guess what? Iron beats bronze every time in a battle. And one of the reasons King David was able to do as well as he did, as fast, is because there was a period of time where he's on the run from Saul, who have bronze. Guess where he takes up refuge? With the Philistines. Philistines were the first in that area to have iron. Well, what do you think he learned? Iron. So when he then gets control, and all these other people outside of the Philistines, because who's the biggest problem for David when he's on the throne? Is it all these other people, the Amalekites, all the other ites? No. The biggest problem are the Philistines, because guess what? They got the same technology. The other ones do not. And so he's able to, go and get you a bronze sword and a bronze shield, and then go and get you an iron sword and an iron shield, and then you and your buddy get together and y'all hash it out. Guess what? Guess who's going to win every time? It's iron. And so if you are the new Pharaoh, and you've got this large group of people that you don't know if they can fully be trusted, because they backed, or at least they were blessed by the old people who were not Egyptians, and you finally got them out, you're only talking about a little bit of time before Philistines invade Egypt too. I mean, after the Exodus, if you look at Egyptian history, you know what happens? There's another guy waiting to come right in. And guess who it is? It's the Philistines. So, I mean, you can think about, I mean, you can just start to put, take out faith, okay, and just look at it from what would you do if you were now the leader? Well, you can see what happened. I mean, I'm not trying to defend him or redeem him, but I'm not sure I wouldn't have acted any different. Now what's wonderful is that in the beginning, Pharaoh is given outs. It's not till the end of the plagues that it's really on. All throughout this whole plague stuff, when we get into that, you're going to find that God gives even Pharaoh and Egypt some outs. They just don't take them. And so finally at the end, it's like, well, I tried to help you. Now we're done. And so then it's really on. The last plague. So. Well, who? God hardens? Oh, we're going to get to that. So hold on. We're going to wait. I mean, who actually hardens? Is it, I don't want to answer that question just yet. Is it God hardens Pharaoh's heart as if he's just a pawn on the table? Or are there things that, have you ever saw something in someone and it gets played out and you say, well, I knew that was going to happen? Because what was on the inside actually played itself out. So just don't, I don't want to, because I got a lesson on that. When we get to that, we're actually going to talk about it. So, all right, so let's take a break. We're break time. Take a break for Right?
Is Betty okay?
She is. She's in a rental car that she doesn't really like to drive while her car is getting repaired, and so she's sort of staying at home more than anything else.
Did she have a bet?
Somebody I think bumped into her. Betty Stinson. She's fine. I just think somebody ran into her. Okay. Just want to touch on a couple of other things that show up in the book of Exodus that are important for us. The first thing is we don't really get an explanation for the enslavement. You can't make the same type of... There are two other major enslavements or levels of captivities that show up in the Old Testament. One of them is with the northern kingdom, with the Assyrians. The other one is with the southern kingdoms, with the Babylonians. We do know, as the Old Testament, if you read into the Old Testament, we do know that one of the reasons for captivities have to do with the concepts of sin or disobedience. You do not have that in Exodus at all. And so you cannot make the same conclusion that what took place in the Exodus was because of behavior or action. It's just not explained. And we actually don't get the concept of sin, doesn't show up until Exodus 32. What the two things that are given to the Hebrews when during the Exodus is they're given a sacrificial system. What do you do when there is breaking of the law? And they're also given the law itself. But that doesn't happen until till Ten Commandments.
Well, I've always heard the term Egyptian slave master. I think I always thought that's why they had them.
I missed that. Say that again.
Cheap labor.
Right. Oh yeah. Exactly right. It's thank you. And who needs a filter? That sounded good, didn't it? Yeah. That's what I tell my kids. And who needs slides?
You took my filter.
I'm sorry. Filter, if you'll, we'll just kind of be passing them around, and if you need one, just take one. How about that? But they are, but it definitely is. That's exactly right. Cheap labor. Some of it is strategic, in the idea of you've got to control what could be a variable if you are invaded again, and so some of what Pharaoh's doing is acting as a strong leader. I'm going to control, I'm going to solidify my border. And, which means that if I have to take a certain level of population and enslave them, then, you can see the logical conclusion behind that. But what's not, this is what I want you to get though, but what is not mentioned in Exodus is the reason of enslavement is due to behavioral or sinful activity, because the whole concept of sin that shows up for the Hebrews does not happen until Exodus 32. And so why would you hold somebody accountable to obedience to the Ten Commandments when the Ten Commandments have not been given yet? Does that make sense?
But they weren't living under the covenant particularly.
Well, there is some recognition of that. The covenant that showed up in Abraham is still some form of still being alive. Because when Moses, think what happens to Moses. Moses, he's born, he's with his mom for a little bit, she puts him in the Nile, ends up with Pharaoh's house, grows up under Pharaoh's care in some form or fashion. He goes out, what he tries to do is usurp the throne. It's not just, that's what he does. And but then he's on the run. He's he's on the run for a number of years. The scriptures say 40. Whether or not it's a literal 40, we don't know. Could just be for a period of his life. When he comes back and tells them what he's witnessed, remember one of the complaints that Moses has to God is, well, who am I? The next question is, who are you? And so, and what God tells him, it says, when you go back, tell them who I am, and that I remember the covenant. Well, when he first comes back, he is received by the Hebrews. All right, well, that's exactly right, as the leaders. And so there is a recognition of, either they receive him because he's their way out, or they receive him because what he informs them about his experience with God, there's some memory of that. And so, I mean, both of those are fairly probable. And so what, even though it's not well defined with 10 Commandments and things of that nature, there, you can draw from the text that there still was this understanding of who God, Yahweh, maybe not called Yahweh, Elohim, which would be creator God behind it all, inside of a world of a polytheistic, culture. So whether or not it was sola, only, monotheistic Elohim for the Hebrews, or whether or not Elohim was the chief God amongst a number of other Egyptian gods, that we don't know. We do know that when the plagues take place, the plagues are not arbitrary. The plagues, each plague deals with a certain power structure in Egypt. For instance, when the frogs come, all the Egyptian gods, pull up the History Channel whenever they have something about Egypt, and they show you the pictures of the tombs and whatnot. All the Egyptian gods are portrayed with human bodies, animal face. Okay? And notice then what part of the plagues, what they attack, or what they look like. Fertility, the fertility god was a human body and a frog's head. Well, when the frogs come, what happened? Well, fertility, sign of life. What do the frogs do? No, hang on. They die. And they just pile up. And they stink. All right? So if your God, if the face of your God for life and abundance and fertility is a frog's head, and all of a sudden you look out onto the grounds and you see nothing but dead frogs, well, that's sort of like, God almost has a sense of humor, oh, really? Okay, this is your God, the personification, of this God, and all I see is dead frogs. All right? The Nile was the life of Egypt. What's the first plague deal with? The Nile. There's others. The last one is Ra. You know what the god of Ra, the supreme god in the Egyptian polytheistic world? He's the god of the sun. And he's the over all the other gods. Well, what's the plague that comes before? What's the ninth plague? Darkness. So when we get into the plagues, we'll spell all that out. But they're not just whatevers. The plagues are, they tackle certain areas of, and they have a pattern to them. Because in the beginning, the priests are able to replicate whatever Moses and Aaron do. But the third one, they can't. So when you read in, if you haven't read it yet, when you read into the first part of Exodus, you'll have Pharaoh's own priests going, well, this is bigger than us. He must be doing this with the finger of God. And so that shows up. They're able to replicate some. And then when you get to plague 4, see, the first 3 plagues are universal. What takes place inside of, for the Egyptians, also takes place for the Hebrews. When you get to plague 4, there's separation. And so from 4 forward until you get to the last plague, at least 4 through 9, the Hebrews are spared. And so, again, and if you look at what deities or what power structures, religious or social power structures, that the plagues are addressing, they are power structures that should be in their religious culture to overcome some level of separation between Egyptians and Hebrews. But what you have with Yahweh is, no, I'm drawing the lines now. And so when we really play and lay this all out, it's really interesting of what's going on inside the plagues. They're not just, just one day flies, the next day darkness, the next day. They are strategic in nature. And because what's at stake is who ultimately is the most powerful. Is it Yahweh or is it Pharaoh? And the chief part of Pharaoh's look is the raw God symbol is what he wore right here, and it's a cobra's head. And so, and it's got a sun, the picture of a sun. And, so Pharaoh was the embodiment of Ra. That's what he said. And so, you've just got God just picking that off one at a time. Did you have a hand?
I was just thinking, I had always thought of the plagues as occurring to impress Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but that sounds almost like they also, especially the separation between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, that it was to show the power of God to the Hebrews over all these other gods.
Well, it could be both. Part of that is, what we do know that the Hebrews had still some understanding, or at least we conclude that the Hebrews still had some understanding of at least what was passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and down the road. How viable that was, that we don't know. Your conclusion is correct. There could be what God is doing for the Hebrews and what God is doing to the Egyptians. Because, and to further your point, later on, the Hebrews have to choose. Do I go back? Do I go forward? And that's what they have to do. And, so, because after we leave the plagues and they leave, basically out of Egypt, the book of Exodus transitions from leaving out to now going forward. And so the acts of God are seen as sustaining His people more so than redeeming His people. So it's interesting. That's a good comment. Sure. Yeah, when you get into chapter, the question was the whole concept of calling out to God, like maybe probably another word would be prayers or something like that. The first couple of chapters, you really don't get, God is sort of just watching. Okay? Now, when God enters into the picture, God enters in first with the idea of, I have heard, I have seen, I have heard, I remember, and I will act. There's 4 verbs that show up. And so, so you do have this idea of God moving in. Now what the questions that we ask from that is, well, why'd you wait so long? We don't know. There's just some things that the book does not answer, and it's not that it's just not concerned with it. Okay, like why were they enslaved in the first place? Well, we don't know. Well, because you had a Pharaoh that came to power, and guess what? This was a problem for him.
Isn't that also the business of inquiring? I just happened to notice it right at the end of the 2nd chapter. It says, out of their slavery, their cry for help goes up to God.
Right.
And that's right at the end of the 2nd chapter. That's a little evidence of that there still was a feeling of that covenant.
Right, exactly right. But it doesn't say anything about God hearing it. No. You don't get that till later. And so I think you can make a case to some degree that there is some level of, to use our language, faith understanding with Yahweh. Maybe not, they don't know the term Yahweh. They would have understood it in Elohim, El Shaddai, the El parts of God, but not Yahweh. Yahweh is a personal, that's the name, it's really not even the name of God. It's the name, whatever the name of God was considered so holy. It's a tetragrammaton. Yeah, and so they came up with another name to mean that name. We don't even know what the name of God is in the Old Testament. We know the name that they came up with that was the symbol of that name, which was Yahweh. Right, but the actual name itself, to say the name of God was to basically be a form of blasphemy. And so they came up with another name, which was Yahweh, so they could say that name and everybody knew that that's what they really meant over here. So that's kind of a technicality.
The idea of enslavement is that these stories particularly came to be the beginning of the Hebrew people, and the stories would start with, we're all in enslavement, so they would understand.
Sure. What you've done is what Becky's talking about is, we look at this story and we see their enslavement, and we can make the same conclusions in our own life. That's what the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament does. They make what is called a hermeneutical shift, where they take a lesson and they see it through the lens of either their own humanity or they see it through the lens of God's activity inside of a larger picture. And that's exactly what Hebrews does. Paul does this all the time, because when we get to the central themes that show up, like covenant, names of God, Lamb of God, you get that for the first time in Exodus. And we're going to spend some time around that when we get to the actual Passover and then the festival. Paul does that hermeneutical shift with the Lamb of God seen through a larger picture now with Christ. And so you see that in a great deal of his writings in the New Testament. Jesus does the same thing. Now, what happens in the upper room when Jesus reinterprets the Passover experience seen now through what? Himself. Isn't that what he says? Go back and read. John's Gospel is the best description of this. Go back and read the, you can probably start around 14, 15, 16, 17. The upper room process in John's Gospel is long. You've got a lot of discourse that takes place about Jesus and his disciples because John's Gospel is written thematically. It's not written like the synoptics that follow his journeys over a period of time. John's Gospel is arranged, which is the reason why you have the wedding at Cana early, and you got John the Baptist later, or early in some part and then later on. John's Gospel doesn't follow the same pattern as the synoptics, because the purpose of his writing was to see Christ through these ideas and these symbols. And so when John writes, and of course now he's taking some of language of Jesus, he arranges his gospel thematically than, say, more of a chronological nature like you do with the synoptics. One quote I just want to leave you with is, before we look at the outline, and then we're going to transition real quick to the filter. This is what Exodus does and why Exodus is such a good book. It underlines the nature of God as a holy and humankind as sinners. We get that show up. And Becky, that's kind of what your point, if I want to use some different terminology. It explains the meaning of blood and sacrifice for the first time. It's a book of grace where God reaches down, or from heaven, and the law teaches redemption and a style of life according to God's character, heavenly terms. And some of the great biblical truths and theological themes that show up through the rest of the Scripture. Now, they're foreshadowed in Genesis. We get a peek into it. But Exodus pulls it all together, and it becomes a springboard by which so much of the Old Testament and so much of the New Testament, they pick up on that. And so it is a pivotal book for the whole of the Bible. It's a pivotal book for the Old Testament. It's a pivotal book for Old Testament, New Testament, and which is why it's one of the reasons why we're studying it. You really can't see. You have to see so much of the rest of the Old Testament and so much of the New Testament through what takes place in the Exodus. It's that significant theologically for us, and which is why we're so. We can quickly make these larger theological shifts about our own life, about humanity in general, when it's talking about just a certain group of people. Because it's easy to make those jumps and see the larger picture of what God's trying to do. So it's sort of the way the outline shows up. You have a couple of different parts. The first part, which goes to around chapter 13, has to do with just Israel, the Exodus. God is redeeming the people out. Then once you move and they're on their way to Sinai, you get God walking with them, sustaining them. And then, when you get into the latter parts of Exodus, what you have now is how they're going to live, how that all plays out, and how God dwells with the people, not just in coming down, leading out, not just sustaining, but now as an integral part of who they are. All right? Got it all now, right? Ready to go? So we're all good. All right. I know that was a lot to take in. We're going to start next week where we'll actually get into the chapters. And so if you haven't read chapter 1, read chapter 1, maybe chapter 2. But I do want to spend real quickly, I want us to look at this filtering concept. Now this is, I'm not saying, I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with this filter idea. But the day that, for me, understanding that there are just some predominant themes that we gravitate towards, so often it comes out of our experience. Okay? So, there's a reason why we might lean towards one concept or attribute of God than another. And that's all good. And all of these are well versed in Scripture. Now, the last little row, just gives you a few of the Scriptures. It's not the complete list. I mean, you could write pages on Scriptures that have to talk about the transcendence of God. The transcendence means separate, above, whatever creation is, God is completely other. And so you might have heard the concept holy other. That means transcendent. And holiness is a transcendence concept. And so whenever the Bible, whenever the Scriptures say be holy because I'm holy, what they're talking about is that God is completely other. You got to pay attention to that. And so, if God is holy or transcendent and God is separate from creation, well then God is the creator. And so what you have, salvation is God renews creation because creation has been polluted. Sanctification, that's the to use a number of different words, could be the fullness of salvation, could be the fact or the process by which we become holy. I mean, you can see information around that. Look at the role of the church. That's very significant for us because in all of these, you can see how denominations or how people sort of kind of geek towards certain missions because it comes out of their theological understanding. You take if God is sovereign, and many of your Protestant denominations, this is where you sit. This is where we sit to some degree. Sovereignty is a huge attribute and lens for Protestants. And so you got God, out of the Protestant Reformation, you got God as king. And so, people who belong to this king, well, they're his subjects. Well, he calls them saints. Well, so that's who we are. And so this is just good for thought and good for reflection. People who theologically their major lens is righteousness, then look how this plays out. It's God as judge. You can see how you interact with the world. Well, it's the good people and the bad people, the wheat and the weeds. The church is nothing but the people who've been redeemed. And which then means entrance into the church means that conversion has to take place first. All right? So you can see how some of this plays out. Which then if you play that out in baptism, well, you don't baptize until you've been converted. So you have what we call believer's baptism. If you got more of a parental theme, you can just see some of this playing out. Now we could elaborate on all of these because we could put a whole new section in here that has to deal with how we would define sin. Is it breaking of the law? Is it, not living up to the moral component? We could also put another row in here that talks about Jesus. How is Savior seen? So we could elaborate on this, but these are just some general concepts to start kind of thinking out. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is important is to find your theological center. All right. What I mean by that is, again, all of these are biblical. So don't see, well, gosh, I kind of lean towards, for instance, if someone said, man, I lean towards purity. Well, and someone else leans towards love or sovereignty. Well, that's wonderful, good. That doesn't mean one is more important than the other. But if you at least know where you come from, then it helps you understand why you act the way you do. Remember we always say this. It just always seems to come out. asking yourself why is a great question. Now, asking other people why, not so great. But why do, for instance, why do I just kind of naturally ask yourself, for instance, why do I naturally lean towards sovereignty? Sovereignty. God is sovereign. Well, it might be that the whole concept of protection is important for you. Does that make sense? Maybe you come out of some type of history where that's in jeopardy, or maybe imminence. What we mean there is that God can be known. God is experiential. If you grow up in a household where there's not a lot of, authority figures, where there's a huge gap of emotion or experience, I can promise you at some point in your life, an immanent God is important. I want to feel God. I want God to be near me. That might help explain if you've ever wondered. Maybe not. But there's some good stuff here, and I just throw that to you as just for some further reflection. No, ma'am.
I think we're in all of these.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me make sure this part is clear. Say if you sort of lean towards God as parental figure, love, that doesn't mean the other ones are not very much active in your life. Just generally speaking, most people, will lean towards one more than others. For instance, if what do we got? How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there are more than this. It doesn't have to be 7. These are just the most common ones. It might be something like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It might be that this one, whatever one that is, I don't know let's just call it love, all right? It doesn't mean that the other ones are not important to you, but normally there's just one that we lean towards. And if you want to know, where you sit on this, pay attention to how you talk about God. I mean, your words are wonderful descriptions about what goes on inside of you. If someone came up to you over lunch and says, well, tell me who God is. And immediately you say, well, God is love. Well, guess what? That's a tale, or, God is my Redeemer, or, just pay attention to how, pardon me? Yeah, Heavenly Father, how you pray, okay? How you address God, that'll give you some heavy insight. And, but now listen, don't go here thinking, I got to figure out who I am. No, that's not what this is about, okay? This is just something, just in human, it's not an anxiety-producing exercise, okay? By any stretch. I mean, it really is. I mean, this is just, we just naturally lean towards certain denominations. Normally lean towards certain, concepts, and they do it with roles and Trinity. Some denominations lean toward first person. Some denominations lean towards second person. Some denominations lean towards third person. It doesn't mean that the other two are not important, because they're very much a part of their behavior, their life, their doctrines, their dogmas. But there's normally one that might just kind of tip the scale. And, it's helpful, to know that. If you kind of spend time reflecting on this and you say, gosh, every time I pray, I say Heavenly Father, I talk about God so much, about love and grace and things of that nature. Well, then that might, you might be leaning towards this whole concept of love and father or parent. And, maybe then to think about, to help well-round your theology, study things that have to deal with God's transcendence. Okay? I mean, or pay attention to God's, the concept where we talk about God's, the work of Christ, Christ as priest, Christ as purifier. These are just tools to help you grow. It's not, don't come back in here, we're going to divide you into homes, everybody over here that's transcendence, sovereignty, we're not going to do all that. It's not what this is about. You know what? I don't know where I got this. Might even be John's. I've got one. This is not mine. I've got one that looks more like, it almost looks like I need about 2 or 3 pages, but I can't find it. So I don't know if I found this, or if I asked John if he had one, or if I saw it in if you come in my office, we're going to quit right after this. If you come in my office, I got stuff strode everywhere. One of the things I love about Few is the boy is organized. With 15 backups of everything. He's got a directory for, where everything is. I chase rabbit trails, okay? So I was as scatterbrained as the day is long. And so, if you ask me to like when y'all say, tell me what I just said, oh my gosh. I don't know. I'm a process theologian, which means that I don't sit behind my desk and form all this stuff and then, put it in nice, wonderful packages and then give it. What I do is I just constantly soak in as much as I can, and in the process of teaching or in the process of thinking or in conversation, whatever, then I'm forming. It literally is, it's real-time processing. And so, a lot of times I'll go back and watch these because I have to figure out, where I'm at. And, some of it so I can start the next lesson where we left off. But, which is one of the good things about at least some of our teaching staff is, if you sit with Grace for a while, she approaches it differently. If you sit with John, he approaches it differently. If you sit with me, approach it differently. And so, ideally what would be great is over a period of time, you kind of get a little bit of all of that, because all of us are coming at it from a different, because my lens and John's lens, they are not the same at all. And there are some things that we really do disagree on. The role of Christ. And I'll tell you one thing that we disagree on: the cutoff point for salvation. All right, I have my, 20 years ago it was this. It's not that now. And so and part of it is from further reflection. I'm a highly logical person, which means theology has got to make sense to me. God, the biggest stumbling block for me with God, coming to God, was, does it make sense? Well, when that hurdle was crossed, all right, I'm all in, okay? But it took a while to get over that hurdle. And, there are others who, there's some other people who faith is easy for them, okay? They just it's part of their DNA. They just wake up with it. Well, I'm not. I'm skeptical of everything. And so when I read something, when I read, I'm also one that goes and looks at all the footnotes and then processes the footnotes and then goes and find that source. And if I don't have it, at least I'll read a rebuttal to it to make sure, where we're at on that. And which is why I love the traditions and the history of the church. That's a little bit more than probably what y'all want to know. Because that's 2,000 years of other skeptical people. Well, I need people to help me think through that stuff. Because my personality type, I can't sit behind this place for 3 hours and not move and only think and then write. All right, I'm active. I'm hyperactive. I've got to, and so I can get, I can't read for 5 hours straight, and I can read for about 5 minutes, and then I've got to make a note or something because I get squirrely. So anyway, we're all way off the part. So we need to stop here before Pardon me? Well, and that's there's theologically, we agree with about 95%. Both of us are fairly evangelical, so there's a level of where we're at. He's probably a little bit more conservative than I am, theologically speaking, and socially, social application normally follows theological thought, and so which is good. The good news is that there's a pretty wide wake inside the church, and so it's all good. All right. Yes, I did. I got one. Y'all did not get one? Okay. You know what? Betty's not here to make our copies. So, yeah, if you'll pick one up on the way out, I think 43 is the number, and we'll be good. Also, you should have received an email that says we're starting back again. If you did not, on your way out, give your email to Kathy. And so we can just kind of make sure the list is accurate. Or if your email's changed and whatnot, we can kind of go from there. All right, any other final comments before we leave?
Can you answer just real quickly?
Probably not, but I'll give it a go.
Is there, on all these filters, is there one that the Methodists
Yeah,
focus on more than the others?
love.
Okay.
Hands down, that's the largest thing for Methodist Church. Right.
She was just in tears talking about the love and the support that she
Right.
from our church.
Right. Yeah, the comment is, many of you know Miss Velma, and she has had some difficulty health-wise, physically, getting back up to speed through rehab, and so she hasn't been able to make it. And but a number of y'all have reached out multiple times to her, and that's been a real source of strength for her. And that echoed by so many people, Velma Patterson. But, yeah. And so I appreciate the way you do take ownership of each other, and that's really a very loving quality, and I just want to encourage you to continue to do that. So many of the ministries that go on behind the scenes here at St. Paul, I mean, really to talk about them, you need someone like a John who could chart it. And but I mean, even from the flowers to the note cards, the people who participate in our prayer ministry, and the constant writing of notes and the daily prayers for people. I mean, that's really fantastic. And I just want to say a word of gratitude and a word of encouragement. So, all right, go in peace. May the Lord bless you. See Becky on the